The 80-20 Principle, The Secret to Achieving More with Less, by Richard Koch, published in 2017. The 80-20 Principle by Richard Koch is a self-help book about how to achieve maximal results from minimal input. The 80-20 Principle states that the universe is imbalanced in such a way that 20% of causes lead to 80% of results. By identifying the inputs that are most important in any venture, personal or professional, it becomes possible to reap big rewards from little effort. The first thing to know about the 80-20 principle is that the numbers 80 and 20 are somewhat arbitrary. The actual numbers can be, and usually are, more or less. What's important to understand is that, generally speaking, a small number of one's actions leads to most of the things that happen in one's life. Referring to this universal truth as the 80-20 principle is a form of shorthand. The 80-20 principle is counterintuitive in that most people tend to assume that all inputs matter equally. They mistakenly believe that the effort they pour into a given situation will equal the rewards that come out of it. For example, many people cling to the false belief that hard work alone will build wealth. In fact, effort and reward are not closely linked. One can become rich by making relatively passive investments, for example. The roots of the 80-20 principle go back to Vilfredo Pareto, an economist who developed a theory that later became known as the Pareto principle. Examining patterns of wealth in 19th century England, Pareto discovered that a minority of people held the majority of the country's wealth. He then discovered that this observation applied not just to England or to the 19th century, but to many other countries at many other times. Later, his observation was generalized to fields other than economics. The 80-20 principle has two applications: 80-20 analysis and 80-20 thinking. The analysis involves a mathematical calculation that discerns the relationship between two groups of data. This approach can be useful to an economist like Pareto, but it is too technical and involved for most people. The 80-20 thinking approach is less precise. It involves brainstorming and deep thinking about how the 80-20 principle might apply to any situation. An 80-20 thinker asks, is it possible to spend less time, effort, and money to achieve results that are the same or better? The answer is always yes, by tweaking the 20% of inputs that matter a great deal and ignoring or eliminating the 80% of inputs that matter very little. Over the late 20th and early 21st centuries in the United States, the 80-20 principle has grown more pronounced. The wealth gap between its richest and poorest citizens, for instance, continues to grow. This is true not just of individuals, but also of businesses. Monopolies and near-monopolies are thriving in the American business landscape. One reason is the power of networking, which has grown exponentially with the advent of the Internet. As networks expand, they increase exponentially in value, so it's easier for companies like Apple and Twitter to thrive, and more difficult for their competitors to survive. Becoming more aware of how the 80-20 principle is operating in one's life and in society can help anyone make the most of their resources. Best of all, it's a process that offers real pleasure, unlike stressful time management approaches that count minutes and hours. This report is based on the 20th anniversary edition of the book. Key insights. 1. There is no direct relationship between effort and reward. 2. One should strive for effectiveness over efficiency. 3. 80-20 thinking can greatly enhance one's professional life. 4. 80-20 thinking can greatly enhance one's personal life. 5. One must be thoughtful about setting priorities. 6. Companies often strive to become ever more complex. Simplicity is better. 7. Companies and business people should identify where the majority of their business comes from and focus on serving those customers well. 8. Behemoth companies are the new norm in U.S. business. Analysis. Key Insight 1. There is no direct relationship between effort and reward. Often, people mistakenly believe that effort and reward have a cause and effect relationship. They think that hard work reaps big rewards, and little effort reaps little rewards. What they don't realize is that, in fact, most people invest a surprising amount of time into trivial pursuits that bring about little or negative gain. Conversely, some of the activities they spend the least amount of time on reap the biggest rewards. Writing for the Times of India, Santosh Desai illustrates the futility of drawing a direct connection between effort and reward with a discussion about panhandlers. Desai points out that many people have a negative perception of the practice. They associate begging with laziness, interpreting it as a refusal or inability to work. Indeed, many perceive begging to be the opposite of work. Regardless of whether or not this is a principled stance, it is factually false. Begging for money is, by definition, not passive, and it sometimes requires exposure to extreme weather or standing for long periods of time. In busy cities, begging may require innovation because there's a lot of competition. While it's inarguably work, the reward is often little. Desai concludes that hard work as a concept is connected more with superficial appearances and stereotypes than with any concrete definition of work. Compared with a job such as watching investments in the stock market grow, for example, the degree of effort put into begging is not proportional to the amount of reward received. The activities that are regarded as work are social constructs rather than naturally occurring categories. The payments that people receive for work, too, are more in line with agreed-upon norms than intrinsic value. Key Insight 2. One should strive for effectiveness over efficiency. All too often, people focus on time management and efficiency. People imagine they are short on time, but in reality, most of what we accomplish requires very little time. The 80-20 principle suggests that 80% of a person's achievements require about 20% of their time. This ratio suggests that efficiency isn't a useful goal in itself. As self-help guru Stephen Covey points out in First Things First, last revised in 2015, efficiency is useless if you're not focused on the right things. Covey illustrates the principle with the example of a driver. Someone who's cruising down the street, encountering little traffic and getting good gas mileage, may be quite efficient. But if the driver is going in the wrong direction, all that efficiency is wasted. Covey describes the difference between efficiency and effectiveness by using a metaphor he calls the clock and the compass. The clock symbolizes how people manage their time. The compass stands for the things people find most important in life. A person needs both of these tools to navigate effectively, but the compass is the more important tool of the two. The goal is not to do more in less time. It is to do the right things in the first place. While many people have a disconnect between their clocks and their compasses, they are oblivious to the gap. Sometimes awareness comes as a result of some major life event like the death of a family member or a divorce. Such an event has the potential to shock a person into reevaluating values and actions. Otherwise, people may drift through life driven by the challenges that present themselves instead of the challenges they choose. For example, busy people may spend too much time on things that seem urgent, emails and phone calls, for example, instead of matters that are truly important. The urgency is false, but people cling to it because it's easier to address small, urgent tasks than big, important problems. Key Insight 3. 80-20 thinking can greatly enhance one's professional life. There are countless applications for business people who wish to apply the 80-20 principle to become better leaders, higher earners, and more satisfied workers. For most businesses, a small number of products or services brings in the majority of revenue. By focusing more resources in these areas, gains can be maximized. In his popular book, The 4-Hour Workweek, Tim Ferriss provides a detailed account of how he used 80-20 thinking to better his business and change his life. After learning about 80-20, Ferriss did a forensic analysis of his personal and professional life. He asked himself which 20% of his work resulted in 80% of his satisfaction and happiness, and which 20% accounted for most of his problems and stress. Ferriss's deep thinking session, which lasted an entire day, resulted in radical changes to the way he conducted business. Realizing that 95% of his income was derived from just 5 clients, Ferriss resolved to dedicate most of his time and effort to fulfilling their needs. he decided to provide the bare minimum of service to the 95% of customers that didn't have a big impact on his bottom line. Finally, he dissolved his working relationship with the 2% of clients who caused him too much anguish on a daily basis. The results were instantaneous. Ferris's quality of life improved because the cuts eliminated almost all of the negativity from his workday. With renewed energy, Ferris analyzed his top 5 customers and used the insights to seek out similar business. Using the power of 80-20 thinking, Ferris not only doubled his income in just 2 weeks, he also cut back his working hours from 80 per week to just 15. He reaped maximum rewards from minimal effort. Key Insight 4. 80-20 thinking can greatly enhance one's personal life. Just as the 80-20 principle can better your business, it can inspire massive improvements in your personal life. Generally, people aren't thoughtful enough about cultivating their own wellness and happiness. A few careful decisions can have a dramatic impact on quality of life. In 2010, for example, Tim Ferriss adapted his 4-hour formula from business topics to his personal life with the release of The 4-Hour Body. Instead of writing a comprehensive guide to health and nutrition, Ferriss chose to focus on highly specific recommendations. The premise of The 4-Hour Body is that Ferriss only needs to provide 2.5% of all possible health and nutrition advice to deliver 95% of potential results. Instead of an 80-20 split, Ferriss offers the ratio of 95 to 2.5. By experimenting with his exercise routine, diet, and supplemental nutrition, Ferriss dramatically built muscle, lost fat, and lowered his cholesterol. His experience with exercise followed the 80-20 dictum that input of effort does not necessarily drive results. He spent only 4 hours in the gym each week and still achieved dramatic results. With regard to diet optimization, Ferriss strives for simplicity. He offers just 5 ironclad rules, which he refers to collectively as the slow-carb diet. Ferriss's first rule is to give up white carbohydrates like rice, potatoes, pasta, and bread. Rule 2 is to craft repetitive meal plans that revolve around whole foods. Ferriss also recommends sticking to no-calorie or very low-calorie beverages, with the exception of wine in moderation. Rule 4 is to avoid all fruit. Ferriss's final rule is that dieters should indulge in 1 day of rest each week. On that rest day, they can eat whatever they want, including white carbs, processed foods, and high-calorie foods and drinks. Key Insight 5. One must be thoughtful about setting priorities. Setting priorities is not an organic process. It's better to take a considered approach. This involves 2 sets of decisions: what to focus on and what to let go. Often the agenda you decide not to pursue is as important as the agenda you embrace. In his landmark text, The Effective Executive, Peter Drucker recommended 4 rules of thumb for identifying the right priorities for making this process as fruitful as possible. Drucker's first rule is to orient yourself to decisions that affect the future instead of decisions that redress the past. Many people inadvertently spend too much time contemplating past mistakes or bemoaning sunk costs. It's better to let go of those feelings and focus on moving forward. Drucker's second related rule is to minimize problems and emphasize opportunities. In an organizational setting, leaders should make sure their most effective employees work with potential opportunities instead of trying to fix old failures. This process of matching the right people with the right tasks requires constant reevaluation, so Drucker recommends reassessing at least twice a year. Third, Drucker suggests that leaders must relentlessly insist on asserting their vision rather than going with the flow of what other people think. Busy executives too often cede their schedules to other people's demands. The only way to change this pattern is to break it by asserting authority and agency. Executives who let other people's priorities direct their focus are ineffective and superfluous. Drucker's final rule is that executives must set priorities that are ambitious instead of pursuing goals that are safe. Good leadership requires courage and the ability to push past banal expectations. In aiming high, executives will inspire their teams to not just success, but also greatness. Key insight 6. Companies often strive to become ever more complex. Simplicity is better. Companies have a tendency to become more complex as they grow. Ideally, businesses should strive for simplicity. Simple doesn't necessarily mean doing business on a small scale. It's more about containing costs. Journalist Bo Burlingham has described companies that emphasize simplicity and excellence as small giants, which is also the title of his 2016 book. He first used the phrase in 2003, which is around the same time that, as editor-in-large of Inc. magazine, he noticed simplicity as a business trend. Small giants, he decided, were successful companies that emphasized greatness over growth. They turned down opportunities to expand, choosing a values-first approach. Some of the small giants Burlingham identified were Cliff Bars & Company, the energy bar company, Union Square Hospitality, a group of restaurants owned by Danny Meyer, Anchor Brewing, the beer company, and Zingerman's Community of Businesses, a collection of specialty food shops and eateries based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. At Zingerman's, for instance, the founders turned down what many people would consider a fine chance to become a national chain. Instead, Zingerman's decided to expand in Ann Arbor. All of the other companies in the book declined similar opportunities. In deciding which companies deserve the designation of small giant, Burlingham set certain parameters. Size didn't matter. A small giant could be small or large, or somewhere in between. Growth wasn't important either, he decided. Sometimes small giants choose to downsize. If small giants decide to grow, they go about it in a sustainable manner, gradually building towards expansion, instead of drastically scaling up. Another distinction was access to capital. To be considered a small giant in the book, the company had to have lucrative offers from potential investors or other sources of funds. Another characteristic that small giants shared was an obsession with excellence. Excellence didn't necessarily equal revenue, though small giants are generally quite profitable. Instead, excellence might mean the equitable treatment of employees, stellar customer service, the regard of industry peers, or very high-quality products. Key insight 7. Companies and business people should identify where the majority of their business comes from and focus on serving those customers well. Businesses and entrepreneurs generally earn roughly 80% of revenue from approximately 20% of customers and clients. Instead of trying to provide the same level of service across the board to 100% of customers, it's better to focus on the core 20%. In 2015, American Express implemented a series of changes designed to redouble the company's attention on its core clientele, which was and is premium cardholders. When the credit card company was formed in 1966, it was marketed as an executive credit card. But over time, American Express sought to expand into less affluent markets. When the company lost key partnerships with Costco and JetBlue, revenue suffered and 4,000 employees at American Express lost their jobs. These losses were compounded by a stagnant market and legal difficulties. The value of the company's stock suffered as a result. The strategy that American Express implemented in 2015 was to embrace its core customers by offering new, attractive benefits and perks to Gold Card holders. This was, in many ways, a return to the company's fundamental value of serving the wealthy. Even during the period when the company had expanded into the middle-class market, its Gold Card membership tier experienced massive growth. No longer able to court middle-class Costco shoppers, the company did not seek to replace them. Instead, the company increased efforts to serve wealthy people by offering rewards points and other perks related to costly expenditures like luxury travel. Reinvigorating its core business has paid off for American Express, which enjoyed gains of about $25 a share from February 2015 to February 2019. Key insight 8. Behemoth companies are the new norm in U.S. business. In the United States, the fact that monopolies or near monopolies are rapidly becoming the norm can be attributed to the power of networking and the rise of the Internet. Perhaps no company embodies this phenomenon more than Facebook, which is a big part of the daily life of billions of users around the world. In The Four, business professor Scott Galloway examines the rise of Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook, which have succeeded in part because they have made themselves indispensable, or at least seemingly indispensable, to people's lives. Each of these 4 companies has its own claim to ubiquity. Amazon, for instance, created Prime, a service used by more than half of U.S. households. Google is the world's preferred search engine. Apple makes devices that people use every day, as well as content for those devices, such as apps and music. Facebook is the most successful platform in human history as a matter of scale. Galloway explains that marketing used to be a matter of scale or targeting, never both. For instance, Super Bowl commercials reach a huge audience, but advertisers have no control over who is in the audience. The best that advertisers can do is guess, and there's no way to avoid the fact that certain commercials will be wasted on the millions of viewers who have no interest in, say, a brand of beer or prescription medication. Facebook's innovation was to combine massive scale with the ability to target certain people with certain ads. It mines people's data for insights it can use to make sure a message reaches the advertiser's intended audience. And as a result of this relevance, Facebook makes a huge amount of money in advertising. As Facebook became more embedded in users' lives, it started charging companies who wanted to use its news feeds to reach their customers. For years, Facebook was able to perform these actions unimpeded. But starting in 2018, sparked by the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the public began to take a more serious and sustained interest in whether or not Facebook's data collection practices are ethical. If users lose faith in Facebook, they may decide it's not, in fact, a necessary part of their lives. Important people. Richard Koch is a prolific author who has popularized the 80-20 principle, also known as the Pareto principle. He's also an investor, entrepreneur, and consultant. Vilfredo Pareto, 1848 to 1923, was the Italian economist who established the Pareto principle. Author's style. The 80-20 principle is divided into 5 parts. Part 1, which consists of only the first 2 chapters, establishes the history of the principle and what it means today. Part 2 focuses on how the principle applies to entrepreneurs and businesses. It contains 6 chapters. The third part, which is 8 chapters long, examines how individuals can apply 80-20 thinking to their personal lives. Part 4 contains most of the third edition's updates. It examines the impact of social networks and the internet on the burgeoning wealth gap and how to best handle recent social and technological changes. It contains more illustrative examples than perhaps any other portion of the book, including a long case study on Apple's iPhone. Part 5 is the author's reflection on comments and insights from his readers. Koch engages with critiques of the book, mostly posted on Amazon and sent via email, in a manner that's most unusual, going so far as to include his email address. An extensive notes and reference section closes out the volume. Koch's style is largely conversational, if repetitive, particularly with regard to the phrase 80-20, which is used 500 times. The sections are well organized. The chapters often end with a section or numbered list to summarize key points.